The village of Bethany was quiet that evening, hushed beneath a blanket of lavender twilight. Dust rose in soft spirals as sandals brushed against the stone path, leading toward a modest home at the edge of the olive groves. A fig tree leaned slightly toward the entrance, as if bowing to those who passed, and within that house silence reigned. Miriam knelt beside her son's bed, her hands folded tightly, her forehead resting on them. The small clay lamp on the low table flickered, casting shadows across the earthen walls. Every now and then, she looked up, eyes dry now from too many tears. Her son, Elior, lay still. The fever had not broken. His breathing came slow, shallow. She had not left this room in 3 days. Not since the illness began. Not since the life in her only child's face began to fade. "Please, God," she whispered again. Her voice was hoarse, grainy like the dust beneath her knees. "Please, don't take him from me." But the silence remained. That terrible, sacred silence. Miriam had been strong for so long. Strong when her husband died of sickness 3 winters ago. Strong when the drought came and the barley harvest withered in her hands. Strong when she walked to the well every day with aching arms and returned to an empty house save for her child's laughter. She had held it all together because she had to. But now, as she watched her son grow thinner, as she counted each breath like it was the last, something in her finally broke. She bowed her head low and began to weep, not the quiet tears of a strong woman holding on, but the deep sobs of someone letting go. In the darkness behind her closed eyes, she remembered a day from long ago, when she was just a girl and her mother took her to hear the rabbi from Nazareth. That was the first time she'd seen Jesus. He had stood on a hillside near Galilee, with the sea behind him and the sky wide and blue. There were thousands there, yet when he spoke, it felt like he was speaking just to her. "Blessed are those who mourn," he had said, "for they shall be comforted." She hadn't understood then, but she had felt something, a presence, a warmth that filled the cold corners of her chest. That same presence stirred now, in the silence of the room, in the stillness of her son's bed. Not a voice, not a vision, but something even more certain, a holy nearness. She opened her eyes and stared at the cracked jar of water on the table. It had belonged to her mother. Years ago, it had been dropped and shattered. Miriam had painstakingly glued the pieces together with resin and care. The cracks were still visible, but it held water. It had held through everything. She reached for it now, her fingers brushing along the broken seams. And then the words came, not from her lips, but from the depths of her soul. "I am the broken jar." And she knew that was where his strength would begin. Not in her holding it together, not in her pretending to be unshaken, but in her surrender. "Lord," she whispered aloud, "I can't do this. Not without you. Not without your strength." The flame of the oil lamp flickered brighter. "I give you my weakness. I give you my fear." Outside, the fig leaves rustled. The night air shifted. Inside, something changed. Not the fever, not yet, but something in her, like water poured into dry ground. She took Elior's hand and sang softly. It was the song her husband used to sing. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." And as she sang, her voice trembled, but not from fear anymore, from hope. Miriam stayed by Elior's side until dawn. The darkness passed slowly, hour by hour, like a heavy blanket being pulled away from the earth. The only sound in the house was the shallow rhythm of her son's breath and the soft ticking of the clay water jar cooling in the corner. She barely noticed when sleep overtook her, her body curled in a fragile knot beside the bed, her hands still wrapped around his small fingers. And in her sleep, she dreamed. Not the kind of dream made from memory or worry, but the kind that comes like a gift, a sacred moment where heaven brushes against the soul. She stood in a wide field, green and endless. The sky above her was bright but not blinding, and ahead, walking slowly toward her, was a man in white. She knew him instantly. Jesus. His face was kind, his eyes full of sorrow and joy all at once. There were no crowds here, no sermons, No miracles being performed, just him and her. She fell to her knees. "I have nothing left," she whispered. Jesus knelt beside her. "That is where my strength begins." She looked into his eyes. "But I'm so broken." He reached out, taking her hands into his. "Then give me your brokenness. Let me carry it." She hesitated, ashamed. "Even the anger? Even the fear?" He nodded. "Especially those." In that moment, she saw it clearly. Her heart, like the cracked jar at her bedside, fractured, worn, leaking in places. But when he held it, light poured from the cracks, not despite them, but through them. He smiled. "This is how my power is made perfect, in weakness." Miriam woke to a shaft of sunlight cutting across the room. The lamp had burned out. The birds outside had begun their soft songs in the olive trees, and Elior was breathing deeper. She sat up quickly. His forehead, once burning, now felt cool beneath her hand. His cheeks held a faint blush of color, and then his eyelids fluttered open. "Mama," he said, voice rasping. A sob broke from her lips. "Elior," she whispered, "you're awake." He blinked slowly, then offered a sleepy smile. "I had a dream of a man in white. He said I would be okay." Miriam's hands trembled as she cradled his head. "You will be. You are." She kissed his forehead again and again. And as the tears flowed, they were no longer tears of fear, but of thanksgiving. Later that morning, Miriam brought the cracked jar of water to her neighbor's house to share the news. "He is healing," she said, her voice calm but shining. "He lives." The neighbor, an old woman named Naomi, cupped Miriam's hand. "You look changed, child." "I am," Miriam said. "Not because everything is fixed, but because I know he was with me in the breaking." That evening, Miriam lit the oil lamp again, this time not in desperation, but in gratitude. And as she tucked Elior into bed, she looked at the jar on the table and whispered, "You still hold water, and so do I." The news of Elior's healing spread quietly through Bethany. Though Miriam spoke little of the dream or the nearness she had felt, the people noticed the change in her. She walked now with a steadier step, eyes lifted not only to the road ahead, but to the heavens above. Something in her had been restored. It was late spring when Naomi, her neighbor, came knocking one evening, her hands trembling, her face pale. "My brother's wife, Leah," she said, "has been left with nothing. No bread, no coin. The creditors come tomorrow." Miriam set down her spindle and looked up. "What do you mean, nothing?" "Her husband died of the fever," Naomi whispered. "Left her with 2 sons. All she has is 1 jar of oil." Miriam's heart tightened. She thought of the cracked water jar. She thought of Jesus. Without hesitation, she rose and tied her shawl. "Let's go." Leah's home was smaller than Miriam's, nearly hidden beneath the slope of the hill. Inside, the smell of morning still lingered. 2 small boys sat silently by the wall, their knees pulled to their chests. Leah stood as they entered, her eyes red, her hands wrapped tightly in her apron. "I know you've come to see if I have anything left," she said, her voice flat. "But there's nothing." Miriam stepped closer. "I haven't come to take. I've come to remind you of what you still have." Leah's eyes brimmed again. "I only have the oil." "Then we begin with the oil," Miriam said softly. That night, Miriam prayed. She knelt beside her son's bed once more, not out of desperation, but intercession. "Lord," she whispered, "as you multiplied hope in me, multiply provision in Leah. Show her that you do not forget the widow, the mother, the broken." And then she remembered the words of the prophet Elisha, the jars, the neighbors, the miracle. At dawn, Miriam woke early and began to knock on doors. "Do you have any empty jars?" she asked. "Clean ones, whole or cracked. It does not matter." The neighbors, puzzled but curious, handed them over. One by one, jars of all sizes began to line Leah's courtyard. Leah watched, astonished, as Miriam returned with the last armful. "We will pray," Miriam said. "Then you will pour." Leah hesitated. "But there is so little." Miriam smiled gently. "His strength begins there." And so Leah lifted her jar, hands trembling. She tipped it gently into the first empty vessel, and the oil flowed. smooth, golden, abundant. Leah gasped. It's still pouring. Miriam laughed, tears streaking her cheeks. Don't stop. Fill them all. One by one, the jars filled. Not one remained empty. By the time the sun reached its peak, the courtyard shimmered with vessels of fragrant oil. Leah held the original jar in her hands, still full. Sell what you have, Miriam said. Pay your debt. Live off the rest. Leah collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed, and Miriam knelt beside her. Do you see, she said, his strength meets us in our weakest places. When we surrender what little we have, he makes it overflow. That night, as Miriam walked home under a sky blooming with stars, she whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. Jesus, she said, you meet every empty jar with the fullness of your grace. In the silence, she could almost hear him answer. Then keep pouring, daughter. Keep pouring. The hills outside Bethany were quiet in the early morning, bathed in mist and the bleating of sheep. Micah, the shepherd boy, had not spoken in nearly a year, not since the avalanche that took his father and left him alone with his flock in silence. He lived with his uncle now, a man stern and practical who did not understand the boy's muteness. Speak up, lad, he'd bark. What use is a shepherd who doesn't shout? But Micah found no voice, only a deep ache that kept him awake most nights. Miriam had seen him watching from afar, on the hillside, staff in hand, eyes distant. One morning she brought bread to the hill. She didn't call his name, just sat beside him, placing the bundle between them. Micah looked at it, then her, then the sheep. You don't have to talk, she said softly. He hears you anyway. Micah's eyes flickered. My son was like you once, Miriam whispered, still, silent. But Jesus heard even that. They sat in quiet companionship as the flock grazed around them. Miriam prayed. Lord, she said, you are the shepherd of shepherds. Speak to the heart of this boy. Let him know he is not alone. A week passed, then another, and Micah waited for something, anything, to break the silence inside. Then one night, a storm struck. Lightning cracked over the hills and the sheep scattered in fear. Micah ran, calling in his mind, not his mouth, heart thundering louder than the storm. He found a lamb near the cliff's edge, trembling, eyes wide. Micah dropped to his knees. Don't move, he mouthed, heart pounding. He reached and the ledge crumbled. He fell hard, catching himself on a jut of stone. The lamb slipped from his arms. No, he cried, the word bursting from him like a flood. His voice echoed down the canyon. He hadn't meant to speak, but in that desperate moment, his soul gave way, and with it, the silence. When he climbed back, battered but whole, the lamb in his arms, he found Miriam waiting at the edge of the woods. You called, she said gently. Micah nodded, voice raw. I called. And he heard you. The stars blinked above them like watchful eyes. The storm had passed. From that night, Micah spoke. Not often, not loudly, but enough. And the sheep still followed him. Miriam told him one evening, even the good shepherd walks quietly sometimes, but he never stops guiding. Micah smiled, voice soft as wind through olive trees. He found me in the silence, and Miriam answered. That is where he always begins. In the village just beyond the olive groves, there lived an old potter named Hadar. His hands were calloused from years of shaping clay, his face wrinkled like the riverbeds of the Judean hills. He lived alone, with only his kiln and his wheel as faithful companions. Each morning, before the sun crested the ridge, Hadar would kneel beside his wheel and whisper, Use me, Lord. Shape me still. Though his fingers were steady, his heart had grown heavy. Years ago, his only daughter had left for the cities. The silence she left behind echoed louder than his spinning wheel. One day, Miriam visited his shop. She came not for a pot, but for prayer. You make vessels, she said. Jesus makes them whole. Hadar nodded. But some vessels are too cracked to mend. She pointed to a crooked bowl, slightly warped but glazed with gold. That one's beautiful. It broke in the fire, he said, and yet you finished it. I filled the cracks with gold dust, he admitted. It's a method from the East. They call it kintsugi. It honors the broken. Miriam smiled. So does Jesus. That evening, Hadar couldn't sleep. He dreamt of clay, crumbling in his hands, reshaped, redeemed. When he awoke, the words of the prophet stirred in his soul. You are the potter, we are the clay. He lit his lamp and sat at the wheel. He took a lump of dry, stubborn earth and added water. Carefully, patiently, his hands moved with grace, spinning, pressing, lifting. Slowly, a new jar emerged. When it wobbled, he did not discard it. When it cracked, he did not despair. He simply added more pressure, more water, more love. By dawn, he had a dozen vessels lined in the sun, each bearing imperfections, each full of beauty. The next day, he invited the village children to paint the jars. They came with laughter and colors, filling the air with joy. Micah brought sheep's wool to wrap the bases. Leah offered oil to anoint the rims. Miriam watched, eyes shining. Jesus, Hadar prayed, thank you for shaping me again. That night, he sat beside his fire, holding the bowl Miriam had admired. Its golden veins gleamed in the light. I see now, he whispered, that the cracks let your light through. And above the crackle of the flames, he heard the softest voice. You were never discarded, only reshaped. There was a carpenter in Bethany named Ezra. His workshop smelled of cedar and olive wood, his walls lined with planks smoothed by years of labor. But lately his hands trembled, not from age but fear. Years ago, his wife had died during childbirth. His daughter Abigail was all he had left. Now, as sickness took hold of her lungs, Ezra's world threatened to collapse. He tried everything: herbs, doctors, prayers whispered late into the night. But nothing soothed her labored breathing. She was only 9. One day Miriam visited. Ezra was sanding a bench, eyes hollow with sleeplessness. She's fading, he said, voice cracking, and I can do nothing. Miriam placed her hand on the unfinished bench. You're a carpenter, she said. You mend broken wood. He nodded slowly. And Jesus, she continued, was one too. He mends broken hearts. Ezra looked away ashamed. But I've stopped believing he hears me. Miriam knelt beside him. Even the wood doesn't resist the shaping. Don't resist him either. That night, Ezra sat beside Abigail's bed. Her breath came in rasps. He took her small hand in his, weeping openly. I don't know what to say anymore, he whispered, but I give her to you, Jesus. She was yours first. He lay beside her, holding her close until sleep overtook him. In the early light of morning, Abigail stirred. Papa, she said, voice soft but clear, I dreamed of Jesus. He touched my chest. It doesn't hurt now. Ezra bolted upright, eyes wide. He placed his hand on her chest. It rose and fell with ease. He wept again, but this time, in awe. Later that day, he returned to his workshop. He finished the bench he had left undone, and carved into its underside were the words, He restores. People began coming to him, not just for furniture, but for prayer, and he welcomed them. I mend wood, he would say, but Jesus mends souls. And every piece he crafted afterward bore a hidden mark, Abigail's healed handprint pressed into the underside of the wood. Because in his weakness, he had met the carpenter of all creation, and he had answered. In a vineyard nestled along the edge of the Jordan Valley, Naomi tended the vines alone. Her husband had passed during a hard winter, and now she worked the soil with hands calloused by sorrow and sun. The vineyard had once thrived under 2 sets of hands. Now under one, it struggled. Every vine reminded her of him, how he'd hum psalms as he pruned, how he'd bless each root as though it could hear. Naomi had not sung since he died. Her neighbors offered help, but she always declined. Grief had built its own fence, higher than any trellis. Then the drought came. Weeks passed with no rain. The vines curled in on themselves, thirsty and brittle. Naomi sat beneath the largest vine one evening, her head resting against the trunk. I can't do this anymore, Lord, she whispered. If your strength is real, show me. The next day, Miriam came carrying a basket of figs. I brought fruit, she said, sitting beside her. Naomi shook her head. The vineyard is dying. Miriam nodded. But you aren't. They sat in silence. Then Miriam began to sing softly, a lullaby of David. Naomi listened, her heart aching. I remember that song, she said. It's still yours, Miriam replied. Naomi cried, and in the crying, something broke open. a thorn in her heart dislodged. That night clouds gathered. By morning, rain poured over the fields. Naomi ran barefoot among the vines, arms lifted. The soil drank deeply, so did her soul. In the weeks that followed, the vineyard revived. The vines stood straighter, fuller. Naomi began singing again, first in whispers, then in strong, vibrant tones. She carved a plaque and placed it at the vineyard gate. His grace is sufficient. And when asked how she endured, she answered, "My weakness taught me to lean into his strength, and the vine once again has borne fruit." Because when the thorns in her life overwhelmed her, Jesus met her in the soil, and he rained grace upon it. Simon, an aging fisherman from the shores of Galilee, had seen both plenty and poverty. Once his nets returned bursting with fish, and his laughter echoed across the waves. Now the sea mocked him with emptiness. Every morning he cast and hauled, and caught nothing. He had lost more than fish. His eldest son had died in a storm 3 years ago, and with him, Simon's joy sank beneath the waves. One morning, Simon sat in his boat, staring into the silver expanse. He whispered, "Why keep trying, Lord? I have no strength left." A voice answered from the shore, "Try once more on the other side." Simon turned. A figure stood in the morning light, just a silhouette. The words were familiar. Something stirred in Simon's memory. Without fully knowing why, he obeyed. He cast his net on the other side of the boat. The water churned. Within moments, the net was heavy, too heavy. He called for help, shouting, laughing, crying all at once. His neighbors came, and together they pulled in a catch greater than he had seen in years. When they reached the shore, the man was gone. But on a stone lay a single piece of bread and a charcoal fire burning softly. Simon wept. That night he told Miriam what had happened. "He is still calling," she said gently. "He has not stopped." "I am too old," Simon replied. "You are just now ready," she answered. From then on, Simon fished less and prayed more. He began visiting nearby villages, helping repair boats, blessing nets, and telling stories of the one who filled his net and his soul. At his home, he carved a wooden sign, "Cast again," and every weary soul who saw it understood. When strength fails, Jesus provides, because even when the nets are empty, his promises are not. Leah lived alone on the outskirts of Cana, in a small stone house with a single window that faced the village. Her husband had been a soldier in Rome's service, lost to battle years ago. Since then, she had raised their son, Eli, who now studied under a rabbi in Jerusalem. Though her days were quiet, Leah never let her heart grow bitter. Each evening, she lit a candle in the window, a tradition she had started the night Eli left, praying that he would always find his way back home. One evening, a fierce storm rolled through the region. Thunder cracked the sky, and wind howled against the walls of her home. Villagers feared floodwaters and lightning, but Leah, though afraid, lit her candle and placed it in the window. Later that night, there was a knock at her door. A boy, soaked and shivering, stood there. "I saw your light," he said. "I got lost on the road. Everyone told me to seek shelter, but I couldn't find any. Then I saw your light." Leah welcomed him in, gave him dry clothes and warm soup. As he ate, he looked around the small home. "Do you always light a candle in the storm?" "Yes," she said gently, "because someone might be searching for a way home." The boy smiled. "That's what my mother used to say." In that moment, Leah's eyes widened. "Your mother, what was her name?" "Hadassah," he replied. Her hand trembled. "That was my sister's name." The boy stared. "Then you're—" "Yes," Leah whispered. "Your aunt." The storm raged outside, but inside the light burned brighter. In the days that followed, villagers began lighting candles in their windows during storms. Leah's small act of faith sparked a tradition of hope. When Eli returned months later, he was amazed to see lights glowing throughout Cana during a night storm. "Why are there so many candles?" he asked. "They're Leah's legacy," a woman replied. "She reminded us to shine, especially when it's darkest. Because Jesus' strength does not only still storms, it lights the way through them." And Leah had learned, even in her weakness, her little flame could guide someone home. In the crowded village of Capernaum, word spread quickly that Jesus was in town. By mid-morning, the house where he taught was filled to bursting, walls pressed with people, windows blocked, and the doorway impossible to reach. Outside, 4 friends carried a fifth. Eaton, a paralyzed man whose world had been limited to his mat for years. His eyes, though weary, still held hope. "If only I could see him," he whispered. "We'll get you there," said Ezra, gripping the corner of the mat. But the closer they came, the clearer it was. They would never reach Jesus through the crowd. Levi, the youngest, glanced up at the roof. "What if—" The others followed his gaze. Moments later, villagers gasped as bits of clay and straw began falling from the ceiling. A hole opened wide and light poured through. Slowly, Eaton was lowered by ropes, down, until he lay at Jesus' feet. The room fell silent. Jesus looked up, then at Eaton. He did not speak first to the man, but to his friends above. He smiled. "Your faith," he said, "has brought him here." He turned to Eaton and gently spoke. "Your sins are forgiven." Then, with hands that had healed the blind and lifted the dead, he touched Eaton's shoulder. "Rise, take your mat, and walk." Gasps filled the room as Eaton stood. He reached down, lifted his mat, and turned to the crowd with tears streaming down his cheeks. Outside, his friends erupted in cheers. That evening, Eaton walked to the lake alone, sat beside the water, and whispered prayers of gratitude. He touched the mat beside him, not as a burden, but as a memory of the moment weakness met divine mercy. And every time he told the story, he said the same thing. "When I had no strength, my friends believed for me, and Jesus did the rest." Because even when the world builds walls, faith can tear through roofs, and in the depths of helplessness, the strength of Jesus breaks through. Mara wandered alone in the Judean wilderness, her feet blistered and her heart hollow. Once a noble woman of Jerusalem, her life had crumbled after her husband's betrayal and public disgrace. No longer welcome among the city's elite, she fled into the wilderness, away from scornful eyes and whispered curses. She brought with her only a flask of water and a scroll containing the words of Isaiah. Each day she walked beneath a scorching sun. Each night she huddled beneath stars that offered no warmth. Hunger gnawed, loneliness pierced. She wept until there were no more tears. One morning, parched and trembling, Mara fell beside a dry riverbed. The scroll slipped from her pack and unraveled beside her. Her eyes fell upon a verse. "The desert shall rejoice and blossom." She laughed bitterly. "Blossom? Here?" As if in answer, a breeze stirred. Her eyes landed on a patch of green pushing through cracked earth. A single wildflower, small, fragile, alive. She stared, then crawled forward and cupped it in her palm. Something broke open in her, soft and deep. She whispered, "If even this desert blooms." She gathered stones and built a small altar. There she prayed, not for rescue, but for strength to endure, for healing, for a new beginning. In the days that followed, Mara discovered an old shepherd's path, winding toward a cluster of palm trees and a spring. She drank deeply, rested, and began walking again. This time, not as one who had lost everything, but as one being remade. She later returned to Jerusalem, not to reclaim her status, but to comfort others who had been cast aside. She carried with her the scroll, and within its folds the memory of the flower that dared to bloom. And she would often say to the brokenhearted, "You are not alone. Even deserts remember how to sing." Because Jesus does not wait on the mountaintop. He walks with us in the wilderness until we find the bloom within the barren. The prison cell in Philippi was dark, damp and cold. The chains clinked against stone with every movement. Paul winced at the pain in his back, lashes still raw from the flogging. Beside him, Silas shifted slightly and whispered, "Still with me?" Paul smiled faintly. "Always." Outside the cell, the city slumbered, but inside something stirred. Not fear, not bitterness, but something stronger, praise. It began as a whisper, Paul's voice, soft and steady, rising in the silence. Then Silas joined, their voices weaving together in harmony, songs of deliverance, psalms of hope. They sang not because they were free, but because they believed in a God who brings freedom even behind locked doors. The other prisoners listened, wide-eyed. No curses, no cries, only worship. Then the earth shook, not metaphorically, literally. The ground trembled, walls groaned, and with a thunderous crack, the prison doors flew open. Chains fell, shackles broke. The jailer rushed in, sword in hand, prepared for death. But Paul cried out, "Do not harm yourself. We are all here." Tears filled the man's eyes. "What must I do to be saved?" "Believe in the Lord Jesus," Paul replied, "and you will be saved, you and your household." That night wounds were washed, bread was broken, and a household was baptized in joy. Years later, Paul would write from yet another prison, "I have learned the secret of being content. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Because sometimes the greatest strength is found not in escape, but in worship. Even in chains, the strength of Jesus sings loudest through the cracks of our brokenness. The Sea of Galilee roared with fury. Waves crashed against the boat's hull, tossing it like a leaf in the wind. The disciples, seasoned fishermen among them, fought panic. Their hands blistered from gripping ropes, their voices raw from shouting over the storm. And yet Jesus slept, curled on a cushion at the stern, unshaken by the chaos around him. He rested in divine peace. "Teacher," Peter cried, stumbling to his side, "don't you care if we drown?" Jesus opened his eyes. He stood calm as dawn and raised his hand to the sky. "Peace, be still." The winds obeyed. The waves quieted. The sea turned to glass. The disciples stared in awe. "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Later that night, as stars reclaimed the sky, John approached Jesus. "How are you so calm in the storm?" Jesus smiled gently, "Because I am the stillness." In our own lives, storms come without warning. Loss, fear, despair. We row and strive, crying out for rescue. But Jesus is not distant. He is in the boat with us. Sometimes he calms the storm. Sometimes he calms his child. In either case, his presence is the anchor, his voice the peace. And so when waves rise and fear threatens to drown, we remember, our Savior sleeps not in neglect, but in perfect authority. In our weakness, he stills every sea, with a word, with a whisper, with a love that never wavers. The small house trembled under the weight of the rain. Each droplet echoed like a drumbeat on the roof, and the wind howled like an unseen beast clawing at the walls. In the middle of the storm, Hannah knelt by her window praying. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. Her husband had left. The bills stacked higher than the hope she could muster. Her strength was gone. She felt like a house built on sand, washed and weakened. But as she opened her worn Bible, her eyes fell on the words of Jesus, speaking of the wise man who built his house on the rock. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Lord, I have nothing left but you." And that was enough. That night, Hannah didn't pray for the storm to stop. She prayed for her foundation to hold. The wind came, the flood rose, but her heart stood firm, not because she was strong, but because her rock was unshakable. Weeks passed, nothing changed on the surface. But within, a deep peace took root. She got up each morning not with a roar, but with a whisper. "I will stand today because Jesus stands in me." When neighbors stopped by and asked how she kept smiling through hardship, she pointed gently upward and said, "My house looks fragile, but it's anchored to the eternal." In seasons of weakness, when everything feels cracked and crumbling, remember the rock beneath your feet. Jesus isn't an addition to the structure. He is the foundation. He is steady when all else sways. And through him, your life, though weathered, will stand. Eleanor lived in the quiet outskirts of a small village, her home surrounded by overgrown hedges and a neglected garden. Her life had once been full, family, music, laughter, but time and grief had taken much of that away. Now in her later years, silence was her constant companion. Each morning, Eleanor walked the narrow path to her garden with aching steps and a weary soul. She no longer planted anything new. She simply sat on an old wooden bench and stared at the wild growth. Weeds tangled around withering roses. Vines climbed over forgotten trellises. It was a garden lost in sorrow, just like her heart. One morning she whispered into the wind, "Lord, why have you left me in this silence?" That day something shifted. A stranger appeared near the gate, a gentle man with kind eyes and hands stained with soil. "May I help you tend this place?" he asked. Eleanor blinked, unsure if this was real, but she nodded. Day by day the man returned. He pruned with care, pulled weeds with patience, and spoke little. Yet his presence brought peace. As the garden healed, so did Eleanor. One day she found the man kneeling beside a blooming rose bush. "Who are you?" she asked. He smiled. "I am the gardener." And then he was gone. But his touch remained, in the flowers that danced in the breeze, in the joy that quietly returned to Eleanor's heart, and in the knowing that Jesus had visited her brokenness, not with noise, but with presence. In seasons of sorrow, when God seems silent, remember the gardener works gently. His pruning is not punishment, it is love. And his silence does not mean absence. It means he is close, kneeling beside you in the weeds, ready to restore what was lost. Nathan sat at the edge of his hospital bed, the heart monitor's rhythmic beeping a constant reminder of his fragility. His body was failing, and the prognosis was grim. Visitors came less frequently now, words grew fewer, and silence stretched longer. Yet in that quiet valley of weakness, something unexpected began to stir. He had always been strong, a provider, a father, a leader in the church. But now he could barely lift his head. The man who once helped others now needed help to sit up. His pride had been peeled away layer by layer, leaving behind the bare soul of a man who could do nothing. But wait. One night, as pain surged through him, Nathan cried out, not in anger, but in surrender. "Jesus, I have nothing left. If you're with me, let me know." No light filled the room, no voice thundered from heaven. But in the stillness, Nathan felt it, a presence, not beside him, but within, a strength that was not his own, a comfort that steadied his breath. Jesus was with him, in the valley, in the pain. From that night on, Nathan no longer feared the shadow. Each day he would close his eyes and whisper, "You are here," and somehow it was enough. He began to encourage the nurses, pray for other patients, and smile in a way that only comes from someone who's touched eternity. When the end came, it was not a moment of despair. It was a homecoming. His last words, "He is with me." In our weakest valleys, when life ebbs and strength disappears, remember, the shadow proves the presence of light. Jesus does not wait for you on the other side. He walks with you through it, and his strength in your weakness becomes your hope, your peace, your song in the dark. In the quiet of early morning, Mary stepped into the empty tomb, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She had come to mourn, to anoint a body, to wrap her grief in ritual. But what she found shattered every expectation. The stone rolled away, the grave clothes lying still, and at the center, something small but profound, a folded napkin. To many, it would have meant little, but in Jewish tradition, a folded napkin left at the table was a sign. "I'm not finished. I will return." Peter saw it too when he arrived, rushing in breathless and bewildered. And though neither understood it all in that moment, the folded napkin spoke to something eternal. Jesus was not gone. He was alive. He was coming back. Years later, that simple detail would still speak to believers walking through their own tombs of sorrow, graves of broken dreams, death of loved ones, silence of long prayers unanswered. The folded napkin became a promise in the darkness. You are not alone. You are not abandoned. He is not done. The risen Christ leaves signs for those who look for them. Not always dramatic. Sometimes they are as small as a sunrise that breaks after a night of tears, a verse that echoes deep in the heart, a moment of peace when the storm still rages. Each one says the same thing. I am with you, and I am not finished. When you find yourself at the tomb, mourning, doubting, weary, look again. Look for the folded napkin, for the sign that the story isn't over. Jesus is still at work in your life. He will return. And until he does, his strength will carry you in your weakness, moment by moment, breath by breath. The door creaked softly as Thomas stepped into the room, where it had all changed. It was the same upper room, still bearing traces of the final meal. The table stood quiet now. The candles had long since burned down. The air held the silence of things remembered. It was here Jesus had knelt to wash their feet. Here he had broken the bread, lifted the cup, and looked each of them in the eye with a love too deep for words. It was also the room where fear had once wrapped itself around their hearts like a shroud after the crucifixion. But something had changed. This was the same space where the risen Christ had appeared, whispering, "Peace be with you," into a room locked by fear, where he had shown his wounds, and Thomas had placed his hands in them and cried out, "My Lord and my God!" Peace, not as the world gives, a peace that passed understanding, that entered through locked doors, through anxious thoughts, through the echoing doubts of hearts struggling to believe again. The upper room became more than just a place. It became a memory of meeting Jesus in the midst of fear. It became the promise that he enters even the rooms we close off from others, even the ones where we hide our weakness, our regrets, our shame. When the weight of the world bears down, when our hearts feel caged by anxiety, when we doubt his presence, the upper room reminds us he comes anyway. He speaks peace, he breathes the Spirit, he strengthens our faith. We don't need to have it all together for him to enter. We only need to be present. The risen Jesus enters rooms locked with fear, sits with the brokenhearted, and brings peace that lingers longer than the night. So when you're afraid, when doubt is louder than faith, go back to your upper room. Be still. Let him speak again. Peace be with you. The sun dipped low as Cleopas and his companion walked the dusty road that stretched from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Their steps were heavy with grief, their conversation a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. The one they had hoped was the Messiah had been crucified, and now even his body was gone. They were discussing all that had happened when a stranger approached. He joined their walk, asking gently, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" Surprised by the question, Cleopas stopped short. "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" the stranger asked. They poured out the story, the hopes they'd had in Jesus of Nazareth, the crushing events of the crucifixion, and the confusion over the empty tomb. They spoke of the women's testimony, of angels saying he was alive, but their hearts still carried the weight of uncertainty. Then the stranger began to speak, not with mere words, but with truth that reached into their very souls. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained how the scriptures pointed to the Christ, how suffering was not a detour, but a fulfillment. Their pace slowed as awe overtook sorrow. The voice of the stranger awakened something long dormant. Hope. As they reached the village, they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." He went in to stay with them. At the table, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And their eyes were opened. In the simple breaking of bread, they recognized him. It was Jesus. But in the same instant, he disappeared from their sight. Stunned, they turned to each other. Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? Without waiting, they rose and returned to Jerusalem, their weariness forgotten, their steps light with purpose. The risen Lord had walked with them, talked with them, broken bread with them. In our own journeys through disappointment and confusion, Jesus walks beside us even when we don't recognize him. He listens, he teaches, he reveals himself when the moment is right. Sometimes he is the stranger who asks the gentle question. Sometimes he is the teacher who opens the word in a new way. And sometimes he is known in the breaking of bread, in the sacred moments of our ordinary lives. If your heart is burning within you, keep walking. He is near. The road to Emmaus is not just their story, it is ours. A path from despair to revelation, from hopelessness to joy. Keep walking. He's closer than you think. The sky was painted with the soft colors of dawn as the disciples returned to the shore. Their nets dragged heavy behind them, not with fish, but with weariness. They had fished all night and caught nothing. Peter, restless as ever, had suggested the fishing trip. Maybe the familiar weight of the net would ease the ache of confusion and the burden of failure. But the sea, once his place of strength, had given him nothing. As morning broke, a man stood on the shore. "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." They obeyed the voice of the stranger, and suddenly the net was overflowing. The haul was miraculous. And in that moment, John turned to Peter and said, "It is the Lord." Without hesitation, Peter jumped into the water, leaving the fish in the boat behind, and swam to shore. The others followed, dragging the net full of fish behind them. When they arrived, they found a fire of burning coals with fish on it and bread. Jesus, the risen Savior, stood there in the morning light, waiting, not with a sermon, not with correction, but with breakfast. "Come and have breakfast," he said. There was no scolding, no reminding of denials, no shame. Only warmth, food, and fellowship. Peter, who had denied him 3 times, was not met with condemnation, but with a fire and a question. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" 3 times Jesus asked. 3 times Peter answered. And 3 times Jesus responded, "Feed my sheep." It was not a test. It was a restoration. Each question mended a wound. Each response brought Peter back to purpose. The risen Jesus meets us in our moments of failure, not to rebuke us, but to restore us. Not with guilt, but with grace. He calls us from empty nets to full hearts, from old shame to new beginnings, from silence to breakfast by the sea. The same Jesus who multiplies fish and calms storms invites us to sit and eat with him, to know we are still loved, still called, still useful to the kingdom of God. So when your night has been long, your net's empty, and your heart unsure, listen for his voice in the morning. He stands on the shore, ready to restore, ready to serve, ready to love. The fire is already lit. The bread is ready. The invitation is simple. Come and have breakfast. Thomas had always wanted truth he could touch. His faith was loyal, but cautious. After all, he had watched the nails pierce Jesus' flesh. He had seen the tomb sealed. He knew what death looked like, and hope felt like a fragile thing. So when the others told him they had seen the risen Lord, he could not bring himself to believe. "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, I will not believe." A week passed, a long week of waiting, doubting, questioning, and then Jesus came. No locked door could keep him out. No skeptical heart could push him away. He stood among them again, and he turned to Thomas, not with anger, not with shame, but with compassion. "Put your finger here," he said. "See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side." The wounds were still there, healed but not hidden. The marks of suffering, now the marks of victory. Thomas, face to face with the risen Christ, did not need to touch them after all. "My Lord and my God," he cried. Jesus' wounds did not vanish in resurrection. They remained as a reminder. Pain has a purpose. Scars can become stories of redemption. Suffering can be the soil from which healing grows. We want a faith without pain, a belief without doubt. But Jesus meets us in both. He invites us to bring our questions, our fears, our need to see for ourselves. And when we do, he does not turn us away. He shows us his wounds. He shows us that the place of greatest weakness can become the place of greatest strength. That our deepest doubt can be the beginning of the deepest worship. And that belief, born through honest struggle, becomes a faith unshakable. If you are like Thomas, needing more than words, longing for tangible assurance, Jesus is not offended by your doubt. He is near. He will show you his hands and his side, not to prove you wrong, but to show you love. In our weakness, he shows us his wounds, and in his wounds, we are healed. The disciples gathered once more in the upper room, not in fear as before, but in anticipation. Jesus had ascended to heaven, leaving them with a promise. The Helper would come, the Spirit of truth, the Comforter, power from on high. Still, waiting wasn't easy. Each day stretched long with questions. What would this power look like? How would they recognize the Spirit when he came? And then on the day of Pentecost, heaven touched earth. A sound like a mighty rushing wind filled the room. Tongues of fire rested upon each of them, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit. Suddenly, the timid became bold. The uncertain became preachers. Peter, who once denied Christ by a fire, now stood before the crowd and proclaimed the risen Jesus with fire in his voice and conviction in his heart. The Spirit had come, and with him came clarity, courage, and communion. He did not come to replace Jesus, but to magnify him, to comfort, to guide, to remind them of all Jesus had taught. This was not just a gift for the disciples. This was a gift for all who would believe, a promise fulfilled, a presence that would never leave. Even today, the Spirit comes. In our moments of silence, he speaks. In our confusion, he brings peace. In our weakness, he empowers. The Spirit doesn't demand perfection. He inhabits our surrender. He fills the empty. He leads the willing. You may not hear the rushing wind or see the tongues of fire, but if you are quiet and open, you will sense him in a scripture that speaks exactly to your need, in a peace that surpasses understanding, in a strength that comes from beyond yourself. Jesus did not leave us alone. He sent his Spirit so we could carry his presence into the world, not by our might, but by his. So take heart. You are not powerless. You are not alone. The Spirit has come, and with him, the strength of Jesus dwells in you. Paul's life was a tapestry woven with revelation and suffering. Caught up to the third heaven, he had seen things no human tongue could speak. Yet he was also given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment him. 3 times he pleaded with the Lord to take it away, and each time the answer was the same. My grace is sufficient for you. Not a removal, but a reassurance. Not escape, but empowerment. Paul learned that weakness was not a hindrance. It was holy ground, a place where the power of Christ could dwell. The thorn didn't disappear, but grace grew deeper. Strength was no longer measured by success or ease, but by reliance on Jesus. In your own life, the thorns may come in many forms: a lingering illness, a hidden struggle, a deep loss, a relentless fear. You may cry out again and again, Lord, take this from me. And heaven may answer, not with relief, but with a whisper. My grace is enough. It is enough to carry you through, enough to sustain you when strength fails, enough to prove that you are not defined by your pain, but by his presence. Grace does not always change our circumstances, but it always changes us. It opens our eyes to the sufficiency of Christ. It allows us to boast in our weakness because we know that in those places, Jesus is strongest. The thorn may not be removed, but grace will never be withheld. In the agony, there is intimacy. In the trial, there is triumph. And in every weakness, there is a well of strength springing up, not from within, but from Christ, who is ever near. You are not alone with your thorn. You are graced, upheld, and loved. And his strength is being perfected in you. The iron bars of prison could not silence the voice of Paul. Shackled in chains, far from the churches he had planted and the friends he had mentored, Paul could have sunk into despair. But instead, he picked up his pen. And the letters he wrote from prison would one day outlive empires. Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians. Letters forged in confinement, yet filled with joy, hope, and the unstoppable truth of the gospel. He wrote not about escape, but about endurance. Not about revenge, but about rejoicing. He spoke of contentment in all circumstances, not as theory, but as testimony. The prison did not define Paul, it refined him. The silence of the cell became the setting for one of the clearest revelations of Christ's sufficiency. Rejoice in the Lord always, he wrote. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. The chains that held him could not hold back the Spirit. When we find ourselves trapped by loss, illness, failure, or grief, we too can become a living testimony. Our lives can preach from the prison, not in bitterness, but in brokenness that shines with Christ's light. Sometimes God doesn't open the prison doors. Sometimes he brings glory in the middle of confinement. The power of the gospel is not proven by escape, but by endurance. And the world watches. Paul's guards heard his prayers. The prisoners heard his praise. And through one man's suffering, the church was strengthened. So if today you feel chained by fear, by sorrow, by circumstances, know this. Your prison can become a pulpit, your weakness, a witness, and your silence, a song of strength, because Jesus is with you. And in the lowest place, his glory shines brightest. It was dark, the kind of darkness that presses down, thick and suffocating. Their backs were torn from the flogging, their feet clamped in stocks. The prison in Philippi was no sanctuary. It was a hole of pain and despair. But at midnight, Paul and Silas began to sing, not because they felt strong, but because their Savior was near. Their bodies were bruised, but their spirits blazed. Praise flowed, not from comfort, but from conviction. And the other prisoners listened. In the night, a sound rose that the world cannot manufacture. It was the sound of faith unfazed by suffering, worship unbound by circumstance, a melody that shook the very foundations of the prison. Then the earthquake came. Doors flew open, chains fell, but no one ran. Because freedom had already come in a greater form, freedom of the soul. The jailer, trembling, asked the most important question: what must I do to be saved? And that night, under the cloak of darkness and the light of grace, a household was baptized, because two wounded men dared to sing in the night. There are times when midnight comes not just on the clock, but on the soul, when everything feels lost and the silence feels loud. But in that hour, a song of faith can still rise. You may not have strength to shout, but even a whisper of praise is a weapon. When you choose to worship in the dark, chains begin to break. Not only your own, but those watching you. The midnight song is not a denial of pain. It is the declaration that Jesus is greater than it. So lift your voice, however weak. Let heaven hear the sound of your faith. And watch what God will do in the darkness. Fire consumes. It devours all in its path. And yet in Scripture, fire is not only destruction, it is refinement. It reveals what cannot be burned away. It purifies, tests, and transforms. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew this well. When they refused to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's golden image, they were thrown into a furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. Surely this was the end. But in the midst of the flames, a fourth man appeared. Like a son of the gods, they were not alone. The fire burned away only their bonds, their clothes, their hair, untouched, but their chains destroyed. Because when Jesus walks with you through fire, the flames lose their power. You may feel the heat, you may tremble, but you will not be consumed. In life, you may face your own furnace, betrayal, grief, financial collapse, mental anguish. The flames may rise, the pressure may intensify, and it may feel like you've been abandoned. But look again. There is another in the fire. He has not left you. Sometimes God delivers us from the fire. Other times He delivers us in it. But always He is near. And what you thought would destroy you may just set you free. You will walk out of it changed, not charred, but refined. Not weaker, but stronger in spirit. Because the fire that was meant to harm you revealed the strength of the one who holds you. So if you are standing in the flames today, do not fear. Jesus is with you, and you will come out of this, not alone, not undone, but more like Him. The wilderness is not a place of plenty. It is a place of wandering, of thirst, of hunger and heat. It is a place where comfort is stripped away and survival is tested. And yet even here, God prepares a table, a feast in a barren land. David knew the wilderness well. He fled from Saul, hid in caves, and walked in fear. Yet he also found that in the wilderness, God was not absent. He was near. In the silence, God spoke. In the loneliness, He comforted. In the hunger, He provided. Manna fell for Israel every day in their 40-year desert journey. Not enough for tomorrow, only for today. And that was enough. So often we long for escape. We cry out for God to remove us from the desert. But sometimes the miracle is not in the escape. It's in the provision within it. A table spread with peace. A cup overflowing with grace. A shepherd who does not abandon his sheep, even when wolves surround them. The wilderness teaches us to depend, to lean not on our strength, but on His daily presence. It strips away illusions of control and makes space for intimacy. It is in the wilderness that we see the strength of Jesus in our weakness. He does not simply lead us to green pastures. He meets us in dry places. He sustains, satisfies, and sanctifies. So if you find yourself today in a wilderness, emotionally, spiritually, physically, know this: God has not forgotten you. Lift your eyes. There is a table before you. He invites you to sit, to rest, to feast, not because the wilderness is over, but because He is enough in the midst of it. And when He is enough, the wilderness becomes holy ground. There was famine in the land. A widow and her son prepared for their last meal, just a handful of flour and a little oil. After that, there would be nothing. Death would follow. And then came the prophet. "Make me a small loaf of bread first," Elijah said, "and then make something for yourself and your son." It was a test of trust, a call to believe in the God who sees, and she obeyed. Every day she returned to the jar and the jug. Every day she found enough. Not in abundance, not a warehouse of supply, just enough. Enough for today. Enough to remind her that God had not forgotten. We live in a world obsessed with overflow, but God teaches us the holiness of sufficiency. He invites us into daily dependence, into trust that He will give what we need, when we need it. There will be days when we feel emptied, days when we look into the jar of our energy, our faith, our courage, and see only crumbs. But the oil will not run dry, because the source is not us. The strength of Jesus in our weakness is this: we are not sustained by our own reserves, but by His endless grace. He is the bread of life, the living water, the anointed one whose oil flows without fail. So bring your empty jar, offer your last handful, watch what He will do with your surrender. And know this: if you have Jesus, you have enough. There are seasons when God seems silent, when prayers return void, when heaven feels closed and the soul echoes with nothing but its own ache. These are the quiet places of faith, the pauses between miracles. But silence does not mean absence. When Elijah fled to the mountain, expecting God in the wind, the earthquake, the fire, God was not there. Then came a gentle whisper, a still, small voice. It is often in silence that God reveals His nearness most profoundly. In silence, the noise of the world fades, the striving hushes. The heart at last begins to listen. Jesus Himself embraced silence. He withdrew to lonely places to pray. He stood silent before Pilate. He bore the cross without protest. In those quiet hours, eternity was speaking. We live in a world that fears stillness. We fill our lives with noise, activity, screens, chatter, afraid of what might surface in the silence. But stillness is not emptiness. It is the womb of revelation. When we cease our anxious activity, we remember that He is God and we are not. In the silence, we find rest for our souls. And in the stillness, His strength rises within us. Not as a shout, but as a quiet resolve. Not in fire, but in peace. So if you find yourself in a silent season, do not panic. God may be speaking more clearly than ever, just in a different voice. Lean into the quiet. Let His whisper steady you. And in that silence, discover again that His strength is made perfect in your stillness. The thorn remained. Paul prayed, and still it pierced. It was a reminder, painful, persistent, humbling. And yet, it was also the path to power. We want our thorns removed. We want healing without pain, victory without struggle, testimony without the trial. But the Lord's answer to Paul still echoes, "My grace is sufficient for you." Sufficient, not necessarily sensational, not always immediate, but always enough. For every thorn we bear, there is a grace that sustains, a grace that whispers to our weary hearts, "I am here." Jesus knew the thorn, a crown of them pressed into His brow. He did not turn away. He embraced it, endured it. And in that agony, He transformed what was meant for shame into glory. Your thorn may not be taken away, but in the pain, He is forming something eternal. Endurance, empathy, holiness, hope. Let us not waste our weakness. Let it drive us to the throne of grace. Let it humble us to walk more closely with our Savior. In your struggle, know this: you are not disqualified. You are not forgotten. You are being conformed to the image of the one who wore a crown of thorns. And in that conformity, you will find the strength of Jesus, not in spite of the thorn, but because of it. Let grace meet you there. This is the anthem of the weary, the cry of those who have walked through valleys, climbed unseen mountains, and found not their own strength, but His. It is not about achieving greatness, but about surviving the night with your faith intact, about waking up one more time, even when hope seemed gone, about standing not because you were strong, but because Jesus held you. His strength is not just the force that parts the seas or heals the sick. It is also the power that keeps a breaking heart beating. It is the quiet resolve to forgive, the courage to try again, the grace to let go. Every chapter of our suffering becomes sacred when Jesus enters it. He was there in the broken jar. He was there in the prison song. He was there in the wilderness table. He is here still, wherever you are, not waiting at the finish line, but walking step by step with you through the shadows and the sunlight. Lifting, guiding, sustaining. When the world says you are weak, unworthy, or alone, remember, Jesus is your strength, not once, not occasionally, always. In your loneliness, He is the friend who never leaves. In your failure, He is the grace that never gives up. In your fear, He is the peace that passes understanding. This is the secret. We were never meant to be strong alone. We were created to lean, to trust, to rest in the arms that carried the cross and now carry us. Let the words settle deep into your spirit. My power is made perfect in weakness. So let us not despise our limits. Let us boast in our weaknesses, not with shame, but with wonder, because each one is an invitation to encounter the limitless love and power of Christ. This is the story of grace, the testimony of the weak made strong, the final chapter of every heart that clings to Jesus. I was weak, but He was strong, and His strength was and is and will always be enough.